In the starting of the movie, we see a plane crashing with engine catastrophic failure sound being heard in the background. The captain is heard speaking to the ATC saying, "Mayday, Mayday, we lost both engines." The ATC replied by saying to the pilots that if they can land on runway 13 LaGuardia, on which the captain says that we can make it back to runway 13. The plane is constantly descending with fire in both engines. In the next scene, we see the first officer saying to the captain that they are too low. We can see passengers in the back screaming for help. The first officer constantly calls the captain to do something in response. That captain is heard saying, "I love you, Laurie," and in an instant, the plane crashes into a building. The captain then woke up from a nightmare, gasping for air. His name is Captain Sullenberger, who is seen very upset thinking about something. There is a news being played on the TV in which we can see a plane sinking in the ocean. The plane had a water landing in which miraculously all 150 passengers, 3 flight attendants, and 2 pilots on board survived. The captain of the plane and first officer Skiles were being investigated on the crash of US Airways 1549, on which the captain insisted that it was instead a water landing and not a crash. The investigators asked that why they could not make it back to LaGuardia, on which the captain replied that they did not have enough altitude, so the River Hudson was the only possible place for a smooth landing. The investigators said that the air traffic controllers said that you were returning for LaGuardia, but the captain replied that as he made the left turn, he realized that they could not make it back, so he had to make a water landing. The investigators said that he could make it back to LaGuardia, but he insisted and said that he eyeballed it. The landing to the river was the safest for the passengers. The reason for the landing in the river was due to dual engine failure, which was caused because of a bird strike. We see his lawyer in a car saying that the investigation was due to the airline who had faced a loss in the form of a plane, and they have to answer the insurance company. Sully's wife, Laurie, is seen calling him to ensure about him, and had a huge press in front of her house. The press is seen gathering Sully, saying him as a miracle maker. Sully is seen with his first officer taking a walk in the street. They are talking about the investigation, and Sully said that he had flown 1,000,000 miles in the past 40 years, but in the end he will be judged for 208 seconds. Skiles calms him by saying the next day will be good for them. Sully is seen giving interview to the press, telling his side that by losing both engines over one of the most populated cities in the world, landing in the river was his safest option. The anchor asked him that how he feels when people call him a hero, on which he said that he is a just man doing his job. Sully goes back in his memory in which he is flying with his dad, who said that a pilot never stops acquiring knowledge. After the interview finished, Sully stood by the window watching a plane crash, similar to his into the building. His lawyer just came and gave him a bad news that the plane's left engine was still operating on, which Sully says that it is impossible as he felt the plane was stopped in midair, on which the lawyer said that there was a chance that the engine was sub-idle, and it still had thrust. There is a heated conversation in the investigation, in which we see the first officer saying that we only survived because the captain did not go by the book. If he would have, we would all be dead. The investigators replied by saying that there was a chance the left engine had thrust on, which Sully replied that the data is wrong, as he was the one on captain's seat. The next investigator is describing some facts that they have done some intense research, in which the computer flying simulators were given the same situation, and all of them were successful in going back to LaGuardia runway. Captain Sully asked for the investigation parameters so that he could review them himself, on which they agreed. Sully is speaking on the phone with his wife and is disturbed by his financial situation. He explains that if the investigators are right, he will lose his license. He recalls the day of the crash. He buys a sandwich from the duty-free, and some passengers who would be on the plane are seen in the scene. Captain Sully and the first officer are seen doing their obligatory checks before the flight. And we can see the passengers in the back just waiting to reach their destinations. The plane approaches the runway and is checked about all its essentials, which are complete. The plane finally takes off. The plane is ascending in a good rate, and we get to see a beautiful view. Captain Sully sees birds coming towards their plane. They collided with it, and some were sucked into the engine. Both the engine blew up. In the cockpit, he sees one engine goes down after the another. He immediately turns on the engine again, which was unsuccessful. He switched on the APU for the alternate power. Both the engines were now gone, and Captain speaks Mayday, Mayday, to the ATC, in which he is saying to the ATC that he has lost both the engines and plan to go back to LaGuardia. The ATC speaks to the local control tower, saying that prepare for an emergency as the plane lost both engines. He replied by saying that he could not make it to LaGuardia and may end up in the River Hudson. The ATC tries speaking to the pilot but had no response. In the meantime, we see Captain saying his passengers to brace for impact as he is attempting a landing in the river. As there was no contact with the captain, the ATC ordered any aircraft in the area to give report immediately. A helicopter sees the airplane moving down to the river. We see Captain Sully attempting a water landing into the river in which his plane warnings was all over him, but he landed the plane into the river. In this situation, Sully decides for a run outside and is constantly thinking about the fact that was the left engine still operating or not. He gets by an aircraft carrier and remembers his old days with his F-4 Phantom. He was having an engine failure with it and was attempting a crash landing. He climbed to an altitude to gain speed and then descended on the runway. He went straight to a bar where he is recognized by the bartender, who praised him for doing his job very well. In the next scene, a big boat is seen starting its regular day with some police officers. We see a driver who is driving onto a bridge and sees Sully's plane come towards the river. Some more people were also seen spectating the same unrealistic events and were amazed to see a plane this low. In the second view of the inside of the plane, we see the crew asking people for bracing themselves and stay down. The passengers were scared and crying. The plane finally landed and had a huge impact in the water. The captain immediately went back to evacuate the passengers, and the passengers were getting out of it. A person jumped out and tried to swim to the shore. Everybody was panicking and saving themselves. In the meantime, we see the same boat who saw the plane in the river and a helicopter immediately coming for help. Everybody is shivering in the cold Hudson. The person finally comes back. The boat and the helicopter arrived at the scene to help people. We see Sully in the plane searching for any leftover passengers. He finally gets out, got on the boat, and was rescued. Immediately, he calls his wife and says to turn on the TV. She was surprised to see the plane in the river, which was flown by his husband. All the rescue teams arrived at the spot and are seen helping the people. Sully is still upset about the accident and wants to know the information about how many people survived in the crash. He says that there were 155 on board and wants to know how many of them survived. Everyone is happy to see their family members alive. The ATC person is seen sitting in the room crying when he was amazed to see that Captain was able to make the landing with all the survivors. Sully is seen in a hospital with a doctor when a member from the pilot union arrives to tell Sully that all 155 people on board survived. He was very pleased to hear this. Sully leaves the bar and is seen calling his friend, to whom he says that the results from the simulation is his right to see, as the hearing for his case is in 36 hours. He wants to see the results of simulations. He tells him that all the possible 20 landings made by the simulator program were not the same as they were made by a computer program and not a real human, so there is a point of human factor involved which cannot be unseen. Sully arrives at the conference hearing. The hearing starts with the investigators saying that before they hear the cockpit recording, they will see the live simulation of the same situations that were on board at the time of the crash. The simulator pilots were doing as instructed and had a bird strike with dual engine loss, but they were able to make it back to the airport at LaGuardia. The investigator says that there was no difference between the computer and human pilot simulation. They conducted another run at the simulator at another nearest airport at Teterboro, on which they had the same result and landed. All were in shock. The investigators insisted that they could make it back to the airport, on which Sully replied that you have not counted the human factor in this simulation. As for the pilots who were experiencing it for the first time. His point was that immediately after the bird strike, the Sims pilot turned back to the airport. They knew the turn and what heading to fly. The pilots did not check for the ATC and did not turn on the APU, so they were already trained for this situation, while in case of Sully, he was facing it for the first time. He asked the investigators that how many test runs they had for the same situation, on which she replied 17. They asked for an added time in simulation for the human factor, on which they were given 35 seconds before the Sims pilot could react. The simulator pilots tried the same landing with 35-second delay and faced a crash landing before reaching the runway of LaGuardia, and the other into the city while approaching for Teterboro. Now the investigation proceeds in favor of the pilots, as the investigators' plan had failed. They are now listening to the voice recorders in the cockpit at the time of the crash, in which they see that immediately after the bird strike, both the engines were blown and were producing no thrust. On the instructions of ATC to make a left turn toward LaGuardia, the pilots had the feeling that they would not make it back to the runway. So Sully planned to land in the river. They were constantly descending at a high rate, and both the pilot prepared for it, as Sully says to the passengers to brace for impact. The pilot turns his plane towards the river. The plane still descends down, and they had no other plan but to land the plane in the water. The plane successfully landed in the river. The pilots take a break from the investigation, in which Sully says that he is proud of them. Upon returning, the investigator gives the news about the left engine, which had seemed to be operational, but the data was wrong and was in fact destroyed before landing, resulting in no thrust. In the end, the investigators apologize to the pilots and say that it was Sully who saved all the lives on board, to which Sully replied it was not only him, but all the crew, ATC, and his co-pilot Skiles.
Make sure to subscribe, turn on the notification so you can watch more interesting content like this. Thank you.